The true measure of a person is revealed by how they treat someone who has nothing to offer in return. The lunch crowd filled the elegant Manhattan restaurant with the gentle rhythm of polished conversations, clinking crystal glasses, and quiet laughter drifting beneath warm golden chandeliers. Business leaders reviewed contracts over expensive meals while tourists admired the skyline beyond the towering windows. Every table had been carefully arranged, every chair perfectly aligned. Every guest expected flawless service. Olivia Brooks moved gracefully through the dining room wearing a neatly pressed black apron over her crisp white shirt, balancing a silver tray with steady hands and a calm smile that never asked to be noticed. She greeted each customer with genuine kindness, remembered favorite drinks without writing them down, and quietly disappeared into the background after every conversation. Most guests never looked twice at the shy waitress. They simply expected the next cup of coffee to arrive on time. Across the room, Daniel Foster entered holding the hand of his 10-year-old daughter, Lily. Dressed in a simple navy jacket instead of the tailored suits that usually surrounded his public appearances, he blended easily among the afternoon crowd. Very few people recognized the billionaire founder whose company appeared on financial news almost every day. That anonymity was intentional. Every Friday, he brought Lily somewhere ordinary because he wanted her to understand that character could never be measured by money. As they settled into a quiet corner booth overlooking the rain-speckled streets outside, Lily watched people with endless curiosity while Daniel quietly observed how strangers treated one another when they believed nobody important was watching. Olivia welcomed them with the same warm smile she offered every table, placing 2 glasses of water beside neatly folded menus before wishing them a pleasant afternoon. Daniel thanked her politely. Lily smiled back. The waitress moved away without realizing she had already made a quiet impression. A few moments later, the front door slowly opened again. An elderly man stepped inside wearing a worn, brown coat that had clearly seen many winters. His shoes were weathered but carefully cleaned. His gray hair was neatly combed despite the light rain that still clung to his shoulders. In one trembling hand, he held a small paper cup containing only a few scattered coins. He looked around the restaurant with hesitation rather than desperation, as though apologizing simply for taking up space. Several conversations paused. A few guests glanced toward him before quickly returning to their meals. Others exchanged uncomfortable looks. The elderly man walked carefully toward an empty chair near the entrance before quietly asking the hostess if he might have a cup of water and sit for just a few minutes to rest. Before she could answer, a sharply dressed customer frowned and spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. People like that should not be inside a place like this. The room felt noticeably quieter. The hostess looked uncertain. The restaurant manager began walking toward the entrance, clearly torn between protecting the restaurant's image and responding with compassion. Daniel slowly lowered his coffee cup without saying a word. Lily looked up at her father with confused eyes before turning back toward the elderly man. Olivia had been carrying fresh soup toward another table when she heard the comment. She stopped walking. Her eyes rested first on the old man's tired face, then on the paper cup still clutched gently in his hand. Without a single dramatic gesture or raised voice, she quietly changed direction and began walking straight toward him while the entire dining room silently watched what the shy waitress would choose to do next. Olivia Brooks set the silver tray gently onto a nearby service station before taking another step toward the entrance. There was nothing dramatic about the way she moved. She did not rush. She did not sigh. She did not glance around to see who might be watching. She simply walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided what the right thing looked like. The elderly man lowered his eyes as the restaurant manager approached from one direction and Olivia approached from the other. Years of difficult experiences had taught him to expect disappointment before kindness. He tightened his grip on the small paper cup holding only a handful of coins and quietly prepared himself to leave before anyone needed to ask. Olivia reached him first. She offered the same warm smile she had given every paying customer that afternoon. "Good afternoon, sir," she said softly. "You look like you could use a place to sit for a few minutes." The old man hesitated before answering. "I only wanted a cup of water. I do not want to bother anyone." Olivia gently shook her head. "You are not bothering anyone." The manager stopped beside her, visibly uncertain. Several guests continued watching from their tables, while pretending not to stare. The sharply dressed customer folded his arms with obvious impatience, waiting for the restaurant to remove the unexpected visitor. Olivia looked respectfully toward her manager. "Would it be all right if I brought him some water while we figure everything out?" The manager paused. Company policy discouraged serving people who were not dining customers, yet nothing in the handbook had prepared him for this exact moment. Before he could answer, the impatient customer spoke again. "My family came here for a peaceful lunch, not to watch people wander in off the street." The words settled heavily across the dining room. Lily quietly looked toward her father. "Dad," she whispered, "why is everyone acting like he did something wrong?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes on Olivia instead. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people show you who they are when helping someone becomes inconvenient." Lily followed his gaze without saying another word. Olivia turned back toward the elderly man. She noticed how carefully he had cleaned his worn shoes despite the rain, how neatly his coat had been buttoned, and how politely he continued apologizing for simply standing near the entrance. Nothing about him suggested anger or entitlement, only exhaustion mixed with dignity. She smiled again. "Please wait here for 1 minute." Without waiting for permission from anyone else, she walked quietly to the beverage station, filled a clean glass with cold water, added several ice cubes, and placed a fresh linen napkin beneath it before returning. She handed the glass to him with both hands, exactly as though she were serving the restaurant's most important guest. The old man accepted it carefully, almost afraid to touch the crystal glass. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It has been a long day." Olivia nodded gently. "Everyone deserves a glass of water." Daniel watched every detail without interrupting. He noticed that Olivia never once looked toward the dining room to see whether anyone approved of what she was doing. She acted as though kindness required no audience. As the elderly man took his first slow sip, a few coins suddenly slipped from his paper cup onto the polished marble floor, rolling softly in different directions beneath nearby tables. Several diners instinctively pulled their feet away to avoid touching them. Before the old man could kneel to gather them, Olivia quietly placed her own tray aside once again and lowered herself to the floor beside him. The scattered coins rolled slowly across the polished marble floor, disappearing beneath elegant chairs and expensive leather shoes. For a brief moment, no one moved. The elderly man instinctively bent forward, his weathered hands trembling as he whispered quiet apologies to people who had done nothing to deserve them. "I am so sorry," he repeated softly. "I did not mean to make a mess." Before he could lower himself any farther, Olivia was already kneeling beside him. Without hesitation, she reached beneath a nearby table and carefully picked up the first coin. Then another. Then another. She placed each one gently back into the paper cup as though returning something priceless instead of loose change. Her black apron brushed lightly against the marble floor, but she never seemed to notice. To her, the dignity of the man beside her mattered far more than keeping her uniform spotless. Several guests quietly watched the unexpected scene unfold. The sharply dressed customer shook his head with visible frustration. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he muttered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Now the entire restaurant has to stop because of one person." Olivia looked up calmly. Her expression remained gentle, but there was quiet conviction behind her eyes. "Actually," she replied in an even voice, "the restaurant stopped because someone dropped a few coins. That can happen to anyone." The customer frowned. "He does not belong here." Olivia answered without raising her voice. "Everyone belongs somewhere while they are trying to get back on their feet." The dining room became so still that even the distant sound of coffee cups being placed onto saucers seemed unusually clear. Daniel Foster leaned back slightly in his chair, studying Olivia with growing respect. Lily watched every word, every expression, every pause. She had never seen someone disagree so calmly. There was no anger, no embarrassment, only kindness that refused to become smaller because someone else lacked it. The elderly man finally looked at Olivia. His eyes glistened, not because of the coins, but because someone had defended his dignity without making him feel like a charity project. "Thank you," he whispered. "People usually pretend they cannot see me." Olivia smiled softly as she placed the final coin into the cup. "I saw you the moment you walked through the door." The simple sentence settled deeply into the room. Daniel noticed Lily quietly lower her eyes for a moment, thinking carefully about what she had just heard. She reached across the table and gently touched her father's hand. "Dad?" she whispered again. "I think he just wanted someone to notice he was still a person." Daniel looked at his daughter with quiet pride. "Yes," he answered softly. "And today someone did." The restaurant manager slowly exhaled, as though a decision had finally become clear. He looked toward Olivia before glancing around at the silent dining room. Whatever concern he had carried about appearances suddenly seemed much less important than the lesson unfolding in front of him. Olivia carefully stood, offering her hand to help the elderly man rise without making him feel weak. He accepted with quiet gratitude. She brushed a little dust from the sleeve of his old coat as naturally as she would straighten the jacket of any customer preparing to leave. A table. There was no hesitation in her movements. No performance. Just ordinary kindness expressed in ordinary gestures. Daniel reached for his coffee, now lukewarm, but never took a sip. He realized that neither his daughter nor he would remember what they ordered for lunch that afternoon. They would remember the young waitress who chose to protect a stranger's dignity when almost everyone else had looked away. The restaurant manager looked from Olivia to the elderly man, then slowly toward the guests who had been watching in complete silence. His expression softened. "Sir," he said respectfully to the older man, "please come with me. There is a quiet table by the window where you can rest for a while." Surprise flickered across the man's tired face. He hesitated as though he was waiting for someone to tell him the invitation had been a mistake. Olivia smiled reassuringly. "Please," she said gently, "you are welcome here." Together they walked toward a small corner table overlooking the rain-covered streets of Manhattan. It was not the finest seat in the restaurant, but sunlight filtering through the clouds had begun to brighten the window, making the quiet corner feel unexpectedly peaceful. Olivia carefully pulled out the chair before placing another fresh glass of water on the table. The elderly man lowered himself slowly into the seat, holding the paper cup close to his chest as though it contained the last pieces of his pride. Across the dining room, the impatient customer shook his head again. "I still think this is bad for business," he muttered while reaching for his check. The manager answered politely but firmly. "Treating people with dignity is never bad for business." The customer said nothing more. Daniel noticed the exchange without interrupting. Lily leaned closer to her father. "Did she change his mind?" she whispered. Daniel smiled faintly. "Sometimes courage spreads quietly," he answered. "One person chooses kindness. Then someone else discovers they can choose it too." Olivia returned to the service station to continue her work as though nothing unusual had happened. Fresh orders were waiting. Coffee needed refilling. New guests had entered the restaurant. She greeted each person with the same warm professionalism she had shown all afternoon. There was no sign that she expected anyone to praise her. Helping the elderly man had never been about being noticed. It had simply felt like the natural thing to do. A few minutes later, she quietly reached into the pocket of her black apron while standing beside the register. She counted the tips she had earned during the lunch rush, folded several bills together, and slipped them into her hand before walking toward the kitchen. One of the cooks looked up in surprise. "Need something, Olivia?" She nodded gently. "Could you please prepare today's soup and a turkey sandwich to go with it?" The cook smiled. "Of course. Which table ordered it?" Olivia glanced toward the corner where the elderly man sat alone, carefully sipping his water. "He did," she answered softly. The cook looked toward the dining room. "I do not remember seeing him order." Olivia placed the folded bills onto the counter. "He is ordering now." The cook understood immediately. Without another question, he accepted the money and quietly began preparing the meal. Daniel had watched the entire exchange through the open kitchen window. He realized she was paying with her own tips, the money she had earned serving customers all morning. Lily noticed it too. "She is buying his lunch," she whispered. Daniel slowly nodded. "Yes." "Do you think she has a lot of money?" Lily asked. Daniel looked at Olivia, who was already carrying another tray toward waiting guests with the same calm smile she had worn all afternoon. "No," he answered honestly. "I think she understands something much more valuable than money." As warm soup began to simmer in the kitchen and fresh bread toasted quietly beside it, the elderly man continued gazing out the rain-speckled window, completely unaware that the simple meal about to arrive had already changed far more lives than his own. The aroma of warm soup drifted gently through the dining room as Olivia carried the tray toward the quiet corner table beside the window. A steaming bowl rested beside a freshly prepared turkey sandwich, a crisp apple, and a small cup of hot coffee. Nothing about the meal was extravagant, yet every detail reflected the same care she gave every guest who entered the restaurant. She placed the tray carefully in front of the elderly man before setting a folded paper napkin beside the bowl. "I hope this helps warm you up," she said with a gentle smile. The man looked from the meal to Olivia with visible confusion. "Miss," he said quietly, "I do not think I can afford this." Olivia simply shook her head. "It has already been taken care of." The elderly man instinctively reached for the small paper cup holding his coins. "Please," he whispered, "at least let me pay something." Olivia carefully closed his fingers around the cup without forcing his hand. "Keep your money. You may need it later." Her words carried no pity, only quiet respect. The man lowered his eyes, struggling to find the right response. "People usually tell me what I have lost," he finally said. "Today you reminded me of what I still have." Olivia smiled softly. "I think you have more than you realize." She returned to her duties before he could thank her again. Daniel Foster watched every moment from across the dining room. Lily remained unusually quiet, her attention never leaving the elderly man as he slowly lifted the spoon with both hands. He did not rush through the meal. He paused before every bite as though reminding himself that gratitude deserved its own pace. Daniel noticed something else. The man never looked embarrassed. Olivia had somehow helped him without making him feel smaller. That realization stayed with him long after the soup had begun to cool. Lily gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad," she asked, how did she know he would not want charity? Daniel looked toward Olivia, who was now laughing politely with another family while refilling their coffee cups. "Because she never treated him like charity," he answered. "She treated him like a customer who deserved respect." Lily nodded thoughtfully, storing the lesson somewhere deep inside herself. A few minutes later, the restaurant became busy again. New guests filled empty tables. Conversations returned. The earlier tension seemed to fade into the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon. Olivia continued moving gracefully from table to table, never lingering near the corner where the elderly man sat. She did not check whether he enjoyed the food. She did not wait for gratitude. Helping him had never created a debt she expected him to repay. Daniel quietly reached for the check before their meal had even ended. When the server approached, he asked one simple question. The young waitress in the black apron. "How long has she worked here?" The server smiled. "About 4 years." Daniel glanced toward Olivia once more. "Has she always been like this?" The server laughed softly. "Every single day? She remembers birthdays, pays for meals when people are struggling, and somehow notices the lonely guests before anyone else does. Most of us stopped being surprised a long time ago." Daniel folded the receipt slowly between his fingers. The answer settled more deeply than he expected. This had not been one extraordinary act performed because important people happened to be watching. No one knew who he really was. Olivia certainly did not. Kindness, he realized, was simply the way she chose to live when she believed nobody was keeping score. And somehow, that made every quiet gesture far more extraordinary than any grand performance ever could. Daniel Foster made no effort to introduce himself before leaving the restaurant. He signed the receipt, thanked the server, and quietly stood as Lily slipped her small hand into his. Together they walked toward the front entrance, but just before stepping outside, Lily looked back one more time. Olivia was helping an elderly couple divide a slice of pie into 2 smaller plates so they could share dessert more comfortably. She smiled with the same warmth she had shown every person that afternoon. There was no difference in her voice whether she served a wealthy executive or someone carrying only a paper cup of coins. Lily tugged gently on her father's sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, "can we do something for her?" Daniel paused beside the glass doors, watching Olivia through the soft reflections of the rainy afternoon. "Maybe," he answered quietly, "but not today." Lily looked confused. "Why not?" Daniel smiled thoughtfully. "Because kindness should never feel like a transaction. If we rush to reward every good deed, people may begin believing goodness only matters when someone important notices." Lily considered his answer carefully before nodding. Outside, the rain had become little more than a light mist drifting across the sidewalks. Father and daughter walked slowly toward their parked car without another word. Back inside the restaurant, The elderly man finished the last spoonful of soup before carefully folding the paper napkin and placing it neatly beside the empty bowl. When Olivia returned to clear the dishes, he stood respectfully. "May I know your name?" he asked. "Olivia," she answered with a gentle smile. He nodded as though committing it to memory. "My name is Walter Green." Olivia repeated it quietly. "It is nice to meet you, Mr. Green." Walter reached into the inside pocket of his worn coat and removed a small object wrapped carefully inside a clean handkerchief. "I cannot repay your kindness," he said softly, "but I would like you to have this." Olivia unfolded the cloth and found an old fountain pen with a polished wooden barrel worn smooth from years of use. She immediately tried to hand it back. "Sir, I cannot take something valuable from you." Walter smiled faintly. "Its value is not measured in dollars. I carried that pen for 38 years while teaching high school history. Thousands of students watched me write with it. I kept it after I retired because it reminded me that words could change lives. Today you reminded me that kindness can too. Please keep it until I have a reason to earn it back." Olivia looked at the pen in thoughtful silence before carefully closing his hand around it once again. "Then I will keep it safe for you until that day comes." Walter's eyes brightened with quiet gratitude. He slipped the pen back into his pocket and smiled for what seemed like the first time in many months. "Thank you for letting me feel like myself again." Olivia gently helped him into his coat before walking him to the front door. She opened it as the cool afternoon air drifted inside. Walter stepped onto the sidewalk and slowly disappeared into the busy streets of Manhattan without asking for anything more. Olivia watched only long enough to make sure he crossed safely before returning immediately to the dining room, tying her black apron once again and picking up another waiting tray. She never noticed that across the street, Daniel had not driven away. Sitting quietly behind the wheel with the engine still off, he had watched the entire farewell unfold through the rain-speckled windshield, and the thoughtful expression on his face suggested that this story was only beginning. Daniel Foster remained parked across the street for several quiet minutes after Walter disappeared into the afternoon crowd. The windshield reflected the soft glow of traffic lights, while people hurried past carrying umbrellas, shopping bags, and busy schedules. Inside the car, Lily continued watching the restaurant entrance. "Are we waiting for someone?" she finally asked. Daniel smiled faintly without taking his eyes off the building. "Maybe I am waiting for a question to become clearer." Lily tilted her head. "What question?" Daniel rested both hands on the steering wheel before answering. "Whether kindness like hers happens only once, or whether it is simply the way she lives." Lily looked back toward the restaurant. "I think we already know." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think you might be right." He started the engine at last, but instead of driving toward his office, he made one unexpected phone call. His longtime executive assistant answered almost immediately. "Good afternoon, Mr. Foster." Daniel spoke calmly. "I need you to help me learn something about a restaurant employee." There was a brief pause. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Daniel replied. "I only want facts. No interference. No surprises for her. Find out how long she has worked there, whether she has any disciplinary issues, and what people who know her say about her character." His assistant sounded curious but professional. "I will begin immediately." Daniel ended the call without offering another explanation. Beside him, Lily smiled knowingly. "You are investigating the waitress." Daniel laughed softly. "Not exactly. I am trying to understand whether what we saw today was a single beautiful moment or a beautiful habit." Back at the restaurant, the afternoon slowly blended into evening. The lunch crowd faded, replaced by office workers stopping for dinner after long days in the city. Olivia continued serving every table with the same quiet grace. She carried heavy trays without complaint, remembered regular customers by name, and gently congratulated an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. Nothing about her behavior suggested she believed the day had been unusual. Near the end of her shift, one of the newer servers approached while folding clean napkins. "Olivia," she asked quietly, "can I ask you something?" Olivia smiled. "Of course." The young server glanced toward the front entrance where Walter had stood earlier that afternoon. "Why did you help him?" Most people would have just followed the rules. Olivia thought for a moment before answering. "Rules help a restaurant run smoothly. Kindness helps people keep going." The younger woman remained silent, absorbing every word. "Were you never afraid someone might complain?" Olivia gently stacked another row of polished glasses. "People are free to disagree with my choices. I only hope they never doubt my respect for another human being. The conversation ended there because new guests had arrived. Yet the young server noticed herself smiling differently for the rest of the evening. Across the city, Daniel's assistant called back sooner than expected. Mr. Foster, I spoke with several people connected to the restaurant. Every answer was nearly identical. Daniel listened quietly. Go on. They all described Olivia Brooks the same way. She volunteers at a neighborhood food pantry on Sunday mornings. She often covers shifts for coworkers without asking for anything in return. Several employees admitted they have seen her quietly pay for meals when customers could not afford them. One manager told me she has never asked for recognition and becomes uncomfortable whenever anyone praises her. Daniel remained silent for several seconds after the call ended. He looked through the windshield as evening lights slowly awakened. Across Manhattan. Then he smiled almost to himself. Lily noticed immediately. What did they say? Daniel looked at his daughter with calm certainty. They confirmed something very important. What? She asked. Daniel started the car once again. Kindness was never something she decided to do today. It is simply who she has chosen to become every single day. The following Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air drifting through the quiet streets of Manhattan. Olivia Brooks woke before sunrise, just as she did every weekend, tying her hair neatly behind her head before putting on a simple gray sweater instead of the black apron she wore at the restaurant. While most of the city enjoyed a slower morning, she walked several blocks carrying 2 reusable grocery bags filled with donated bread, canned soup, fresh fruit, and bottled water. Her destination was a neighborhood food pantry tucked between an old church and a small community garden. She greeted every volunteer by name before immediately helping organize shelves, refill coffee containers, and welcome visitors with the same gentle smile that had become second nature. She never mentioned the restaurant. She never spoke about the elderly man from a few days earlier. For Olivia, kindness did not belong to special occasions. It belonged wherever people needed it. Several miles away, Daniel Foster stood outside his apartment building holding 2 paper coffee cups while Lily adjusted the strap of her backpack. Are we really going to volunteer today? She asked with excited curiosity. Daniel smiled. You suggested it. Lily nodded proudly. I wanted to see if helping people feels different when nobody knows who we are. Daniel quietly admired the wisdom hidden inside her simple question. Then let us find out together. He had chosen the same neighborhood food pantry after hearing about Olivia's volunteer work, though he never told Lily why. He wanted his daughter to discover something naturally rather than through explanation. As they stepped inside the modest building, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and homemade soup filled the room. Volunteers moved quietly between shelves while families selected groceries with calm gratitude. Daniel signed their names on the volunteer sheet without mentioning his company or public profile. He wanted this morning to belong to ordinary people doing ordinary good. Lily picked up a box of apples and carried it toward one of the display tables. Then she suddenly stopped walking. Her eyes widened with surprise before a bright smile appeared across her face. Dad? She whispered, trying not to raise her voice. It is her. Daniel looked across the room. Olivia was kneeling beside an elderly woman, helping organize canned goods into reusable shopping bags while patiently listening to a story that seemed far more important than the groceries themselves. When the conversation ended, Olivia noticed Daniel and Lily standing nearby. Genuine surprise crossed her face before she smiled warmly and walked toward them. Good morning, she said pleasantly. I did not expect to see you here. Daniel returned the smile. Neither did we. Lily laughed softly. Actually, maybe we should have. Olivia tilted her head with quiet curiosity. Daniel looked around the busy pantry before speaking. My daughter wanted to volunteer today. Olivia smiled at Lily. Then you picked a wonderful place. Before anyone could continue the conversation, one of the pantry coordinators hurried over carrying several heavy boxes. Olivia, he called with relief. Could you help us in the storage room? We just received another delivery. Of course, she answered immediately. Without another thought, she rolled up her sleeves and followed him toward the back hallway. Daniel watched her disappear through the doorway before quietly turning to the coordinator. Does she volunteer here often? The man chuckled warmly. Every Sunday morning for almost 3 years. Rain or shine. Holidays too. Sometimes she finishes a late shift at the restaurant and still arrives before everyone else. We keep telling her to rest once in a while, but she always says there will be plenty of time to sleep after someone else has a better day. Daniel Foster quietly picked up a stack of empty grocery boxes and followed one of the volunteers into the storage room without drawing attention to himself. Lily eagerly joined several children organizing canned vegetables onto wooden shelves, laughing whenever someone mixed peaches with beans or pasta with cereal. The atmosphere inside the pantry felt wonderfully different from the polished elegance of the restaurant. Nobody cared about expensive watches or impressive job titles. Everyone simply worked together because there were people who needed help. Daniel carried another heavy box toward the back hallway when he heard familiar voices drifting through the partly opened office door. He slowed his pace without intending to listen, but one sentence stopped him completely. "Walter finally found a safe place to sleep last night," one volunteer said with relief. Olivia smiled warmly. "That is wonderful news." The volunteer nodded. "The shelter had one opening. He kept asking me to thank the young waitress who treated him with respect." Olivia lowered her eyes modestly. "Please tell him he does not owe me thanks. I only hope he keeps believing tomorrow can be better than yesterday." Daniel remained still for a brief moment before quietly continuing toward the storage area. Once again, she had no idea anyone important might hear her words. Once again, kindness appeared to be the most natural language she knew. A short time later, volunteers gathered around folding tables to prepare care packages containing bottled water, fresh fruit, blankets, and hygiene supplies for families facing difficult weeks. Olivia worked beside an elderly volunteer while carefully checking every bag to make sure no essential items had been forgotten. Lily soon wandered over carrying a small stack of children's books donated earlier that morning. "Where should these go?" she asked. Olivia smiled. "Those belong in our reading corner." Lily looked surprised. "You have a reading corner?" Olivia nodded happily. Sometimes children waiting with their parents become nervous or bored. A good story helps time feel a little kinder. Together they arranged the books neatly onto low shelves. Lily noticed many well-loved classics beside newer picture books. "Do you read to them too?" she asked. Olivia laughed softly. "Whenever someone asks." The little girl smiled with growing admiration. Across the room, Daniel watched the conversation unfold while speaking quietly with the pantry director. "You seem fortunate to have volunteers like her," he remarked. The director smiled immediately. "Olivia is one of the reasons many people come back. She remembers names, birthdays, favorite books, and even which children are afraid of thunderstorms. She pays attention to details most of us miss." Daniel glanced toward Olivia once more. She was kneeling beside a little boy, helping him choose between two storybooks with complete patience, as though nothing else in the busy room mattered. There was no audience applauding, no cameras recording, no expectation of reward, only quiet presence. Before leaving the pantry, Daniel noticed a framed bulletin board covered with handwritten thank you notes from families, volunteers, and former visitors. Among dozens of messages, one handwritten sentence caught his attention. It read, "The first person who called me by my name instead of my situation reminded me that I still had a future." The note was signed simply, Walter Green. Daniel stood silently before the board for several long seconds. Then he looked across the room toward Olivia, who was helping another family carry groceries to their car. He realized that what had happened inside the restaurant had not been the beginning of her story. It had merely been the first chapter he had been fortunate enough to witness. The pantry slowly emptied as the afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, leaving behind only a handful of volunteers organizing shelves for the following week. Daniel Foster carried the final box of donated groceries into the storage room when the pantry director approached with a worn leather folder tucked beneath one arm. "Before you leave," the director said with a warm smile, "there is something I think you should see." Daniel accepted the folder without understanding why. Inside were newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and handwritten letters collected over several decades. The director carefully removed an old black-and-white photograph showing a younger Walter Green standing in front of a public high school classroom surrounded by smiling students. Walter volunteered here years before life became difficult. The director explained quietly. "Most people only know the man they see today. We remember the teacher he used to be." Daniel studied the photograph closely. Walter looked remarkably different without the weathered coat and tired expression. Confidence filled his eyes. His posture reflected quiet pride rather than exhaustion. Beneath the picture rested dozens of thank you notes written by former students describing how one history teacher had encouraged them to believe their future mattered. One yellowed newspaper article immediately caught Daniel's attention. The headline described a scholarship campaign organized by Walter nearly 30 years earlier to help first-generation college students remain in school when financial hardship threatened to end their education. Daniel slowly turned the page. Halfway through the article, one familiar name appeared. His breath caught almost imperceptibly. The article mentioned a young mechanic named Michael Foster whose son had nearly abandoned his dream of attending college because the family could not afford tuition. According to the article, Walter Green personally organized local teachers, neighbors, and community members to create a small emergency scholarship that allowed the student's education to continue. Daniel stared silently at the printed words. Michael Foster was his father. The scholarship described in the article had become the first step that eventually allowed Daniel to finish college, build his company, and create the life he now shared with Lily. He had heard fragments of the story while growing up, but his father had never remembered the teacher's full name. Daniel looked back toward the photograph of Walter, suddenly seeing far more than the elderly man who had walked into the restaurant carrying a paper cup of coins. He saw the educator whose quiet generosity had changed countless futures, including his own, long before either of them knew it. The pantry director noticed the expression on Daniel's face. "Do you recognize something?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I recognize a debt I never knew my family owed." At that moment, Olivia returned from helping another volunteer stack folding chairs. She smiled politely, unaware of the discovery unfolding only a few feet away. Daniel quietly closed the folder before looking toward her with entirely new understanding. She believed she had simply defended a stranger's dignity inside a restaurant. In reality, she had unknowingly protected the man whose compassion decades earlier had opened the first door leading to Daniel's future. Life had quietly completed a circle that none of them could have imagined. Daniel slipped the newspaper clipping carefully back into the folder and thanked the pantry director before stepping outside into the cool afternoon air. The city looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Only one thing had changed. He no longer saw Olivia's kindness as an isolated act. He now understood that one generation of compassion had quietly reached forward through time until another compassionate heart chose to carry it on without ever knowing whose life it had already transformed. The week passed quietly, but Daniel Foster found himself thinking about the restaurant, the pantry, Walter Green, and Olivia Brooks far more often than he expected. Every business meeting seemed a little less important after remembering the simple kindness he had witnessed without anyone realizing who he was. Late Friday afternoon, he returned to the restaurant alone. This time he wore the same simple jacket, leaving behind every symbol of wealth that might change the way people treated him. Olivia welcomed him with the same warm smile she had offered during his first visit. "Good evening," she said pleasantly. "It is nice to see you again. Will it be just one tonight?" Daniel nodded. "Just one." She guided him to a quiet table near the window before placing a glass of water beside his menu. Nothing about her manner suggested she remembered anything unusual about their previous meeting. She treated him exactly as she treated everyone else. Daniel noticed that consistency immediately. After serving several nearby tables, Olivia returned to take his order. Daniel closed the menu without looking at it. "May I ask you something before I order?" Olivia smiled politely. "Of course." Daniel looked at her for a quiet moment before speaking. "Why did you help Mr. Green the other day?" Olivia seemed surprised by the question. She glanced briefly toward the rain outside before answering. "Because he needed someone to help him." Daniel smiled gently. "Most people would say that, but very few people would actually do it." Olivia folded her hands calmly in front of her black apron. "When I was little, my mother used to tell me something I have never forgotten. She said that difficult seasons can happen to anyone. If I ever met someone walking through one of those seasons, I should never make the journey harder simply because I happened to be standing on dry ground." Daniel listened without interrupting. Her answer contained no performance. It sounded like a truth she had quietly carried for years. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully placed a folded newspaper clipping on the table. Olivia opened it with curious eyes. Within seconds, her expression changed as she recognized the photograph of Walter Green standing in front of his classroom decades earlier. Daniel spoke softly. I learned something after we met at the pantry. Olivia looked up. Daniel continued. Mr. Green once helped organize a scholarship that allowed my father to remain in college when my grandparents could not afford tuition. Without that opportunity, my father would have taken a different path. Without that path, my life would have been completely different. Olivia remained silent, gently looking back at Walter's younger face in the photograph. Daniel smiled with quiet gratitude. You believed you were helping one man. In reality, you protected the dignity of someone whose kindness changed my family long before I was born. Olivia slowly folded the article and returned it with both hands. I did not know any of that. Daniel nodded. That is exactly why I wanted to tell you. Your kindness was never influenced by what you might receive in return. Olivia lowered her eyes thoughtfully. I think kindness loses something important when it waits. For a reason. Daniel felt the simple sentence settle deeply in his heart. At that moment, he realized she had unknowingly answered a question he had been carrying for years. Character was not revealed when life became easy. It was revealed in quiet moments when nobody expected the world to be watching. Daniel Foster remained seated long after the conversation should have ended. Outside the restaurant windows, evening lights reflected across rain-darkened streets while the city hurried toward another busy night. Inside, Olivia Brooks quietly refilled coffee cups, greeted new guests with the same gentle smile, and returned to every table with calm professionalism. Nothing about her behavior suggested she expected life to reward kindness. She simply believed kindness was part of living well. Daniel watched her for another moment before standing. There is one more thing I would like to tell you, he said. Olivia stopped beside the table, her hands resting lightly against the black apron tied neatly around her waist. Daniel reached into his jacket and placed a simple envelope on the table between them. Please do not open this until your shift is over, he said. Olivia looked at the envelope but did not touch it. May I ask what it is? Daniel smiled gently. Not yet. She nodded respectfully. Then I will wait. Daniel thanked her for the meal, left a generous tip without drawing attention to it, and quietly walked toward the entrance. As he reached the door, Lily entered carrying a small bouquet of white daisies she had insisted on bringing herself. She hurried across the dining room before stopping in front of Olivia. These are for you, she said with a shy smile. Olivia accepted the flowers with genuine surprise. Thank you. They are beautiful. Lily looked up with complete sincerity. I wanted to give them to someone who helped me understand what kindness looks like. Olivia felt her eyes soften. You have already learned something very important. Daniel watched the brief exchange before father and daughter stepped outside together. The evening passed, as every other Friday had. Olivia completed her final tables, polished the last row of glasses, folded fresh linen napkins for the morning shift, and thanked her coworkers before removing her apron. Only then did she remember the envelope resting safely inside her locker. She opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter rather than a business proposal. Daniel explained that after learning the truth about Walter Green and the scholarship that had changed his own family's future, he believed kindness should continue moving forward instead of stopping with gratitude. Enclosed was information about a fully funded university scholarship created in Walter Green's name for adults whose education had been interrupted by family responsibilities. Olivia had not been selected because she had helped Daniel. She had been invited to apply because her life reflected the same values Walter had spent decades teaching others. The letter also explained that Daniel had quietly arranged long-term housing assistance, career counseling, and community support for Walter through local nonprofit organizations, not as charity, but as a partnership designed to help him rebuild an independent life. At the bottom of the page, Daniel had written one final sentence in his own handwriting. My father was given a chance because one teacher believed potential deserved opportunity. I hope this scholarship allows that same belief to continue reaching people neither of us will ever meet. Olivia carefully folded the letter back into the envelope. Tears never came. Instead, a quiet smile appeared as she looked toward the bouquet of daisies resting beside her locker. She realized that no one had tried to repay her kindness. They had simply chosen to pass it forward, just as Walter once had, and perhaps that was the most meaningful gift anyone could receive. Several months later, the restaurant looked exactly as it always had. The crystal glasses still reflected the morning sunlight. Fresh coffee still filled the dining room with its familiar aroma. Guests still arrived carrying conversations about business, family, an ordinary life. Olivia Brooks tied the same black apron around her waist before greeting the first table of the day with the same quiet smile that had never depended on recognition. Very little about her daily routine had changed, yet everything beneath the surface had quietly grown. During the evenings, she attended university classes through the Walter Green Scholarship, studying the communication and community leadership she had once believed she would never have the opportunity to pursue. Every Sunday, she continued volunteering at the neighborhood pantry because she never believed kindness should end simply because life had become easier. Walter Green no longer wandered the streets carrying a paper cup of coins. With support from local organizations and renewed confidence in himself, he now lived in a small apartment only a few blocks from the pantry. Every Wednesday afternoon, he gathered neighborhood children around a worn wooden table at the public library, reading history books, answering curious questions, and once again becoming the teacher he had always been. The old fountain pen remained safely in his pocket, returning to the classroom where it had always belonged. Daniel Foster visited from time to time, sometimes with Lily, never announcing himself before walking through the restaurant doors. Olivia greeted him exactly as she greeted every other guest. Daniel appreciated that more than any special treatment money could have purchased. One quiet afternoon, Lily handed Olivia a folded piece of notebook paper before leaving. Inside was a simple drawing of 3 people standing beneath a large tree. At the bottom, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Kind people help other people grow." Olivia smiled as she folded the paper and placed it carefully inside her locker beside Daniel's letter. Some gifts belonged in the heart more than on a shelf. A few weeks later, the university held a small ceremony recognizing students who had returned to school after overcoming significant obstacles. Olivia stood among them without seeking attention. Sitting quietly in the audience were Walter, Daniel, and Lily. None of them applauded louder than anyone else. None of them tried to claim credit for her journey. They simply smiled because they understood that every meaningful future is built one quiet decision at a time. As the ceremony ended, Walter walked beside Olivia across the campus courtyard. He gently removed the old fountain pen from his jacket pocket and placed it into her hand. This time she accepted it. "I think I have finally earned the right to borrow it," she said with a smile. Walter laughed softly. "No," he replied. "Now it belongs to the next person whose kindness will write a better future for someone else." Across the courtyard, Daniel watched Lily slip her hand into his once again. "Dad," she asked, "do you think one small choice can really change so many lives?" Daniel looked toward Olivia and Walter walking beneath the autumn trees before answering. "I do not think it happens because the choice is small," he said quietly. "I think it happens because truly kind people never realize how far their kindness will travel." The afternoon sun settled gently across the campus as leaves drifted slowly through the cool breeze. 3 lives had become connected not by wealth, success, or coincidence, but by simple acts of respect repeated when nobody expected a reward. The city continued moving at its usual pace, unaware that one quiet waitress had reminded a billionaire, restored a teacher, inspired a child, and continued a legacy that had begun decades before she was even born. Because the greatest fortunes are never measured by what we keep for ourselves. They are measured by the hope we quietly place into someone else's tomorrow.